will presumably be a mugshot at some stage of President Maduro, who has been accused of being the head of a drugs cartel, although there's no evidence so far to suggest that. But this seems to be history repeating itself to some extent, because this is what the Americans did under President Bush Sr. in 1990 with President Noriega of Panama, under slightly different circumstances, which we'll get into in a minute. But what is really going on here? What's Trump up to? Let's speak to Dr. Christopher Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House. Christopher, good morning to you. Happy New Year.
Good morning, Matt. Happy New Year to you.
What a surprise, eh? I mean, the yes and no. I mean, there was the build-up, but actually going in to capture him, that's quite a big move.
Yeah, look, when Donald Trump originally launched, if you will, this buildup, which started in August, it's been going on 6 months now. The narrative changed from this was about drugs, this was about starving the regime of revenue, this was about foreign influence in Venezuela, but eventually he showed his hand, which we knew all along. This was about regime change. But you're absolutely right. I think the hope was always somehow during this long 6-month buildup that this fear of U.S. strikes, even a potential military invasion, when you had 15,000 U.S. military personnel off the coast of Venezuela, the hope was that would be sufficient to rattle the military, the inner circle around Maduro, to kick him out, and the U.S. wouldn't have to do much more. As I referred to it at the time, regime change on the cheap. Yeah. Well, that didn't come cheap. Clearly, they went all in now. During the strikes this morning, I was hearing that they were low-flying helicopters that could be carrying special ops troops. That appears that it was true. So, I think while many people predicted as this went on that limited strikes by the U.S. inside Venezuela, despite the lack of a War Powers Act, because this is quite likely unconstitutional, by the way, in the U.S. Constitution by Congress. But even absent that, I thought there'd be some targeted strikes. What I didn't expect was they would go the full 9 yards and actually go in and take out Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and presumably, as you say, bring them to the U.S. for a mugshot, which will be famous and go viral, and then hold them to trial for narcotics trafficking and for crimes against humanity and the like. But this now opens up a whole new chapter. The vice president of Venezuela just gave a press conference via telephone. She confirmed that Nicolas Maduro had been removed. There are rumors somehow that this may have been somewhat of an inside job, which is plausible given how close this regime is in its inner circle. So now we don't know where we go from here. But clearly, Donald Trump is going to own whatever happens from now on in Venezuela.
Lots of questions here. I mean, why do you think? I mean, there is some confusion about why he's kind of gone on this journey, of actually having regime change. There's the oil, which we've talked about ad nauseam this morning. There is the hemispheric influence, the Monroe Doctrine, as reinterpreted by Donald Trump. There is the fact that Marco Rubio has been driving this issue as Secretary of State. What do you think ultimately is going on here in terms of motivation in the administration?
So I realize I'm going to go against the grain here. I don't think this is about oil, in the sense that there is no need for more oil on the global oil markets. The U.S. has been self-sufficient in oil and natural gas since 2014.
But this is a different kind of oil, isn't it? This is the thick stuff. This is
heavy crude,
the gooey stuff,
which the U.S. is pretty well prepared to process. Yeah. But it's still not necessarily in the U.S.'s interest. Immediately see a glut of oil enter the world market right now. Maybe lock in the resources for American-based companies, yes. What this is really about, as you implied, Matt, are several things. The first is this, oddly enough, is about immigration. In 2024, Donald Trump in the campaign talked about how Venezuelan gangs had taken over a town in Colorado. That wasn't true, by the way. And then he claimed that Nicolas Maduro was opening up his prisons and his mental institutions and allowing them to flee to the United States, where they would sow insecurity and crime and violence. That also wasn't true, by the way. So when he was returned to power, Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela was actually sort of in, if you will, the discussion among the MAGA justification for a tighter border and America first. And then they added to that a lot of misinformation about Venezuela as a source of drugs for the United States. But ultimately, as you mentioned, this was really Marco Rubio's game plan. He, as a Cuban-American former senator from Florida, he looks south, and what he sees as the problem is basically communist governments. And in the case of Venezuela, yes, indeed, it does work closely with the Cuban government of the Castro regime. There's one Castro brother remaining, by the way. And for him, this is about taking taking out a cancer in the Western Hemisphere. So you've got all these competing objectives. The truth is, what we really don't see is much of a game plan for what comes next.
Okay.
There's no president, an interim government that's probably going to be run by a vice president, at least for now. She's the one doing the speaking, but she's by no means clean. She's not the person Marco Rubio wants in office. That's Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. So we don't know what happens in the next 5 days, but Donald Trump has accomplished what he wanted. He removed Nicolas Maduro. The next game plan is really up to Marco Rubio, and I'm not sure he has a plan.
So you don't think there's a plan, an actual plan to get Maria Corina Machado into office?
I can't imagine there is. Look, I mean, her stand-in presidential candidate in 2024 won the 2024 elections. That has been demonstrated without a shadow of a doubt by independent statisticians internationally. But the truth is she's deeply hated by those around Nicolas Maduro, in part because she's threatened to throw many of them in prison and threatened revenge for the several decades period of repression and corruption and criminal activity that she's campaigned against. They're not going to open up the palace doors and say, yes, please, Maria Corina Machado, please come in. So the question is, they're going to try to navigate their own, basically, exit, in which they can save their own heads and potentially even remain in power. And that's where the tension. At what point is Donald Trump going to want to cut his losses and say, well, I'm sorry, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, I only bet up to this point. The rest of it is up to you. It's up to other countries to fill the gap, because there are armed groups. The Colombian guerrilla group, the ELN, it's very present in Colombia. It's quite likely the military, given the level of corruption, will potentially break from this government if it sort of veers in a direction it doesn't like and form its own sort of criminal network. So it's not going to be an easy transition. This is not Chile in 1989, for example.
Right. So it could be really chaotic. I just wonder also, just to get back onto the point of immigration, I mean, he wants to close the southern border. He has deported a lot of Venezuelans, including ones that weren't hardened criminals, much to the annoyance of Venezuelans in Florida who voted for Trump. I mean, these guys are very pro-Trump, and they will be very upset by some of what's happened. Now, they may be delighted by these strikes. I'm sure many of them absolutely are. But if it goes wrong and it's chaotic, you could get even more people trying to flood into the United States. New refugees from a Venezuelan implosion, unless, of course, they're stopped at the Mexican border.
That's exactly right. And this is, again, the problem with the transition plan that was sold to Donald Trump by Marco Rubio was really based on a healthy dose of optimism. We've heard this from Maria Corina Machado and other opposition leaders saying, once we're in power, the immigrants will come back and we will rebuild Venezuela with the skills and talents of those who fled. The truth is, the economy has contracted by 2/3 since Nicolas Maduro came to power. Malnutrition is rife. Schools and hospitals are broken. Bringing these people back is going to take a long time. And it's not going to be immediate reversal. And in fact, as you're saying, the potential for chaos, the potential for violence, the potential for even more economic contraction could lead even to more outgoing migration than we currently see. So again, this is not going to be an easy exit for anyone.
In 30 seconds, we've made this all about Donald Trump, and of course he would like that very much, and to some extent it is. But although international law may very well have been broken here, that's one issue. Nicolas Maduro was not the Nelson Mandela of Latin America. In 30 seconds.
No, he was a criminal. He was a thug. He has crimes. He has charge of crimes against humanity against him. There are more than 800 political prisoners in Venezuelan prisons right now. Some of them have not been seen or heard from for months and even years. No, this is by no means not a saint. You need only look at his array of contexts internationally: Iran, China, Cuba, North Korea, Russia, to understand what he's all about.